And we have come this week to the London Transport Collection, which is in Syon Park, alongside the garden centre, not very far from Syon House itself. Well, that rather powerful noise you've just been hearing, that clanking and hissing, it is actually the changing of points on a tube railway. It is dated, I believe this one, 1906. But you can actually see the points changing when you're here, because we're at already a mock-up. There's a part of the iron tunnel, and there are the rails, only a short distance of rails, only about 8 or 10 feet of rail there, but with the machinery for changing the points. Then at the back of it, they have a photograph giving you an idea of distance, how the trains would run. And there are the two distinct lines, one going to the left and one going to the right. And these are the points, the sort of points, I imagine, which you would find on the Bakerloo line when you leave Baker Street, either for the Stanmore train or the Watford line, as the two tunnels separate. But with me is Mr. John Day. Now, Mr. John Day knows all about this thing. Tell us a little more about this. Is it used today, this particular point changing?
Yes, points very much like this are still in use today. Although this is 1906, as you said, and the whole signals which are associated with the points here and all the equipment, they are the 1906 variety. Nowadays they change somewhat, of course. There are a few signal boxes about still, but mostly they use push buttons rather than these little levers.
Yes, quite. But these, with the public, when they come here, they can operate these themselves if they want to.
Yes, this is the idea. This is a new item, actually. It's just opening, and we hope it'll be very popular, because they can put all these levers, operate the points and signals themselves, and in the rest of the exhibit they can do a lot of other things too.
And also you've got a dial up there which shows you which line you want to go on to, so you can pull the appropriate handle, presumably, and
yes,
the points will then change the way you want to go.
That's a train describer. You can turn the pointer to the destination you want the train to go to and pull a lever at the side, and it comes up on the indicator above your head.
This is really something that people can play with and enjoy and have fun with.
Play for hours, I hope.
That's very interesting indeed. Where should we go to next, you suggest?
Well, this, as I say, dated of 1906. Perhaps you'd like to see one of the first tube cars ever built for London.
Well, now you've come into a very, very old piece of furniture, an old carriage of the tube railway. And John Day, who's the manager of the whole of this collection, can tell us all the history of this thing, because it's, may I just describe it as far as I can see it, it's somewhat of the shape of the modern tube trains, only just somewhat of it, because it's got much lower roof, it's much smaller altogether, it has no strap hangings, it's got great rails like you have on a yacht, which you can hang on to. Presumably they had standing passengers at that time. What's the date of this, John?
Well, this is 1890. It's one of the first cars to run on the City and South London Railway, which was London's first tube railway. When I say tube, I mean deep tube rather than the subsurface lines. The idea in those days was, first of all, we made a small tube. It was only 10 feet in diameter, which is why the car seemed so small, because it was cheaper to do that. And also, the idea was that you didn't need to know where you were, because there was a man standing on the end platform of the car who called out the station names and operated the gates.
It's upholstered in a very comfortable way, almost well comfortable as they are today in a way. It's a padded seat, you see, and a padded back as well, which goes up as far as the back of your neck, rather. And it's known as the padded cell, isn't that right?
Oh yes, they were commonly known as padded cells.
Padded cells.
There were 3 of these to a train, and they were hauled by a tiny electric locomotive.
Well, now, can we go a little further on in our history and go to something a little, not more modern, but not quite so ancient?
I don't know whether you'd like to go back to a more ancient one first and have a look at one of our old steam locomotives.
I didn't know there was a more ancient one here. Let's have a look at this.
Oh yes, so this is one which used to run round the circle lines, it now is. We used to call it the inner circle there. And it used to haul trains around the circle, and it took 70 minutes to do it.
Well, now we've arrived on the driver's platform of a steam engine. We were talking just now about tubes. Now we're with a steam engine, marked Metropolitan. Do you mean to tell me, John Day, that this thing actually travelled on the Underground Railway?
Yes, it did indeed. When the Circle Line, as it now is, was first built in 1863, it was worked by steam. In fact, it was worked by Great Western locomotives originally, but the Metropolitan soon built their own, and this one was built in 1866. And it travelled round the circle, pulling its trains until about 1905, when the circle was electrified. It then went off and worked on the Metropolitan main line out into the country, eventually worked on a small branch line in the Chilterns, and finished up running engineers' trains. And in fact, it was active until 1948, when it was the oldest working locomotive in the country, the oldest regularly working locomotive in the country. And as you see, it's now in honoured retirement. We're rather proud of it.
It's a fine-looking, well-kept and a fine-looking machine, obviously of some considerable age. The brasswork is getting a little tarnished. But do you mean to say that this went through the tunnels of London?
It did indeed.
The driver in the open?
Yes,
No covering of his
just as you see it now. That's right. The only thing it did do was to condense its steam. So the steam didn't fill the tunnels. The exhaust steam from the cylinders was run back through the big black pipes you can see on each side into the water tanks. And the cold water, of course, condensed the steam. The only thing was, of course, the steam made the water hot. So every run round, or 2 run rounds at most, they had to replace all the water.
What about the smoke, though, from the...
Well, the smoke escaped largely into the tunnels through the chimney in the usual way. But it wasn't considered a great disadvantage at the time. Some people didn't like it, but others said it was very healthy. And it was always said that doctors frequently advised patients with chest complaints to take a couple of rides on the underground and breathe the sulphur.
Now we've come above ground onto the roads of London, and we're sitting opposite each other, John Day and I, in what must be one of the oldest buses, I suppose, omnibuses ever built. It has got a row of seats facing each other. They're all lengthways to the whole coach itself, and then 2 at the end, incidentally. Horse-drawn, of course. And this was in use when, John Day?
Well, I must confess this is actually a replica, which was built in 1929. But the original came in 1829, and it was introduced by a chap called George Shillybeer, and it was the very first bus in London. As you see, it's fairly commodious inside, a long-bodied coach, as they called it in those days, and it held something like 22 people. I think it depended how wide the people were. And it was drawn by 3 horses, and the 3 horses were abreast. It's not in line, but they were just side by side.
And then you had your driver in command of the 3 horses. And then was there a conductor on here as well?
Yes, there was a conductor. He was inside if there was room. If there wasn't, he stood on the rear steps, which are fairly wide, as you saw when you came in. And he charged fares. And in fact, the through fare for this route, which ran from Paddington to the Bank, along what was then called a new road, and it's now part of the Euston Marylebone roads very largely, the fare was 1 shilling. And 1 shilling in those days was a lot of money, yes, because I don't suppose the average person earned more than £1 a week at the time. So it really meant that the first buses were conveyances for the middle class, if you like to put it that way.
Yes. Now we've moved to the next bus, which is alongside the one we've just come from, also horse-drawn. Now, I will go to confess that, in fact, I remember these buses myself perfectly well. My brother and I, small boys, used to go regularly once or twice a week from Chelsea, top of Smith Street, to Berkeley Street. And a 19 and a 22 were the buses we used to get onto. And as small boys, when the bus came up and you put your hand up to stop it, no bus stops, of course, you put your hand up to stop it, and we used to scramble up the steps up to the top, hoping that we'd be able to get the seat next to the driver, who sat on a level with the top deck. If anybody was sitting in those seats, we were absolutely hopping mad. But however, often we got them, I remember, and we used to sit next to him. And he always wore a bowler hat. He had a great coat on him, and he had a tremendous cloth across his knees, and his whip, which he stuck alongside him there, and his huge, great brake pedal, which he had on there. And we used to enjoy the ride, come rain or shine. We were on the top of that bus, sitting next to the driver if we possibly could. And I remember them very well. I remember even the smell of them. Oh, I smelled them again, you know. And the pair of horses which he controlled. Well, that's my recollection of this particular bus, John. But what period did this run in London?
Well, they started running in roughly 1880s, early 1880s, and they finished in 1911 as far as the LGOC was concerned. There were 1 or 2 later ones, but by the beginning of the First World War, they'd all gone.
And I remember you banged a great knob at the top. It was a great sort of brass knob, and you bang that to stop the bus.
One of the motor buses around here, we still got one of those on.
Have you? Bang once to stop and twice to go.
That's right.
And a penny ride. Now, the old bulb horn of the first motor bus. This is the first motor bus of all time, is it, John?
This is the first standard motor bus.
Yes.
There were a lot of experimental models before this, but this is the B-type, which was the first standard. And it's the same type of bus, in fact, is the famous Old Bill. In fact, we occasionally call him Old Bill's brother.
There is an old bill that still actually runs, isn't there?
There is an actual Old Bill. It no longer runs. It's in the Imperial War Museum now.
It used to come out at sort of Armistice Day and that sort of thing. All the
That's
pictures of it
right.
at Armistice
Yes.
Day.
Yes, indeed.
Well, I expect many listeners know what they look like. In a way, they're almost the design of the horse bus, only much bigger, and of course much more powerful and so on, and they've got the motor in front of it. The driver is down on the lower deck instead of being right at the top as he is for a horse-drawn bus, but the top deck is still open, and no covering on the top deck. Now, these ran for a very long time, didn't they?
Well, similar buses as did, yes. This particular type, of course, started in 1910, and it ran on well into the 20s. It was replaced by a somewhat larger model, which we also have here. But they ran for a long time, and one notable feature was that something like 7,000 of the chassis were built. Not all became buses, but a large number of them had lorry bodies fitted, and they went off to the First World War and ran in France and Flanders and so on. And in fact, something like 900 of these actual buses did too. This one, with about 400 others, was used for troop movements in and around London.
This actual one?
This actual one.
Well, that sound must be familiar, I think, to some of our elder listeners. John Day, tell us about that.
Well, that was just the warning of approach of a tram, just like the hoot on a lorry, in fact, except it did let people know that it was a tram approaching, and the tram couldn't get out of the way as a lorry could.
That was the great thing about trams, was that everybody had to get out of their way. And I remember the trams which ran along the embankment, they used to go into a tunnel there, didn't they, along the embankment, then appear somewhere up Southampton Row,
That's
underground.
Right. That was the Kingsway subway.
That's it.
Yeah, so,
Yes.
which is still there, except part of it's now being turned into a traffic underpass.
Mm-hmm.
But the trams used to turn off the embankment, as you say, and go up through the tunnel and emerge in Southampton Row, and then they go along through Holborn and so on up to the Angel.
What really, in your opinion, made them disappear off the market at all? Was it the fact that they were too clumsy? Was it the fact they were too noisy, too uncomfortable? Was it the maintenance had to be done, the laying of the rails and the overhead wires and so on?
I think the major factor was that they were inflexible. If the amount of traffic on a route changed, you couldn't change the tram. I mean, once you had the rails laid down, often not, you had to get an active partner to do it in the first place, you couldn't easily change it.
Mm-hmm.
So the motor bus, of course, was very much more flexible. It could go anywhere, the routes could be changed at a week's notice. This is one of the early ones, built in 1910 actually. It was for one of the municipalities that used to run their own trams around London. It was a four-wheeler, as you see, and rather smaller than the ones that the LCC used to run in central London.
Now, could we have another of the familiar sounds of the old tram? Now, that was the driver handling what, John?
So what he was doing was notching up on the controller, as it was called. The controller admitted current to the motors in stages, and therefore acted like an accelerator. There was a sort of rheostat, and so the driver knew even in the dark just what he was doing. He could hear the clicks of the rheostat. By turning the handle in the opposite direction, he could apply electrical braking.
Then what's the other great brass sound? That always seemed to be the most cumbersome thing to wield.
Well, that was the handbrake, or parking brake, if you like. And they very often use them in conjunction, because the electrical brake would bring the tram down to very low speed, and often the final stop was done with the handbrake.
Well, John, I'm most grateful to you for taking all the time you've given up to tell us about these machines, and they are fascinating things. And I do remember some of them myself. What do you suggest would be the most familiar sound to leave the transport?
Well, we've been
collection?
talking about trams. Not many people can hear them now, except at a few preservation places and at the Tramway Museum. But we have got the sound of a tram on tape. We've got a tram here, in fact, which talks to you. But part of it is the sound of a tram of the sort which is involved. Perhaps you'd like just to hear it going.
I would indeed.
You have been listening to John Snagge's London. The programme was recorded by Graham Clifford and produced by Roger Clark.